Welcome to the Nanovation podcast. Information about this and other episodes can be found at fillerlab.com/nanovation. If you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend or leave a review at Apple Podcasts. It really does help. I welcome your thoughts and suggestions. You can contact me on Twitter at Michael Filler or via email at nanovationpodcast@gmail.com.
I really wanted to see what we were working on in our lab, and I wanted to turn that into a usable product that would benefit everyone. And in order to do that, I felt that I have to take it to the market, and to do so, I have to create a company. Do I know anything about running a company in the beginning? Absolutely not.
That's Sang Han from the University of New Mexico, talking about what motivated him to co-found the company Ozazda Energy. In this episode of the Nanovation podcast, Sang shares some of his many experiences developing and commercializing advanced electronic and photonic materials. In particular, Sang and his students have been focusing on materials for radiative cooling. Radiative cooling promises to cool surfaces, such as the exteriors of homes and buildings, even in direct sunlight. We talk about the physics of radiative cooling, different methods for its implementation, and the challenge of developing a manufacturing process suitable for covering entire cities. Along the way, we chat about the ups and downs of global technology competition, how we might incentivize innovation in manufacturing, and the excitement and challenge of starting a new company. We basically cover it all. This is the Nanovation Podcast, an exploration of big innovations emerging from small things. I'm Mike Filler, your host and a professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Enjoy the show. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Sang Han, a professor in the departments of chemical and biological engineering, as well as electrical and computer engineering at the University of New Mexico, to the show today. Welcome, Sang.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast.
You are an expert in electronic and photonic materials engineering and fabrication. You actually direct the Nanoscience and Microsystems program at UNM. Can you describe that program real quick?
Yeah, sure. So currently I'm serving as, so I wear many hats today. One is serving as the program director of Nanoscience and Microsystems Engineering at the University of New Mexico. From now on, I'll just call our institution as UNM. It is a graduate program that actually harnesses all three schools: School of Engineering, College of Arts and Sciences, and School of Medicine. And so we draw from anywhere from physics to chemistry to mechanical engineering, cell biology, cancer biology, etc. So, and we provide, in a way, a foundational coursework that bridge the gap between, let's say your background's in biology, but your future research project is somewhat has an engineering twist. Then our program provides the lowest activation barrier, shall I say, to switch their field into engineering while working on a project that is very much relevant to the student interest and also the advisor's interest. So from that point of view, we are very good at channeling students cross-disciplinarily, if that makes sense.
So it sounded like, and maybe this was unintentional, that you channel them from science to engineering, but it probably goes both ways.
Goes both ways, correct.
Okay. As much as I would like the former, but...
Yeah, as much as I like medicine come to engineering, but yeah, it goes both ways. Channel flows both ways. Engineering students working with someone in life sciences, and in fact, sometimes they do work on brain chemistry, even working on, in some cases, brain injuries, etc. So yes.
Okay. Is there a medical school at UNM?
Yes, UNM has the medical school in the state of New Mexico. It also has the trauma level 1 trauma center. That's the only one in the state of New Mexico as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you guys are in an interesting place. So you're in Albuquerque, and you're pretty close to Sandia.
That is correct. We are very close to Sandia National Labs, which is about just down the street. So if you were to drive, maybe less than 15 minutes.
Okay.
And also Los Alamos is about an hour away north of us.
So you have extensive experience, as I was saying, in electronic and photonic materials engineering and fabrication. You've worked on everything from quantum systems to solar cells to optical composites, and you have a wide range of interests.
Yeah. So, Mike, you're being very kind, but I definitely take pride in that. I continue to remain intellectually agile. Oftentimes, what you and I both observe and see in our field, or in any sort of science and engineering field, is that someone gets her or his PhD, and then they make relatively incremental departure from what they worked on for their PhD or their postdoctoral work. And I think some of us, however, make a pretty different, very large excursion from where they were, start working on maybe even scientific topics they're not necessarily feel comfortable with in the beginning, or they're not familiar with in the beginning. And so once you, I think, overcome that fear in a way, for me anyway, initial fear, I was able to move to a different area where I find these interesting problems that I want to work on, solutions to which may not be something that you're familiar with, but eventually I think it's a much more fun intellectual journey at the end of the day. So you're right. I mean, research topics ranged from, in the beginning, doing very fundamental surface science, both on semiconductors and as well as the metal surface, moving on to even biological separations using nano and microfluidic channels, and sort of in a journalistic way of describing, I guess, then moved on to, of late, we're working on quantum structure growth that is also very different from a traditional ways of growing quantum structures. So if you were to articulate that, the conventional way of growing quantum dots, for example, is at least in semiconductor field, is based on strain-driven growth, Stronsky-Krasnov type of a growth, or you can also use solvothermal type of growth, and also a VLE process that I think, not VLE, vapor liquid, which you call it, the stuff that you're doing,
VLS,
Mike, VLS growth. And there are some of those are the main ways to grow quantum structures. But in our case, we're trying to use thermomechanical trigger to steer these atoms in compound semiconductors, and using diffusion, molecular or atomic diffusion, to create quantum structures post-growth.
So real quick, the Stransky-Krasnov growth you were talking about, for people who don't know, that's delivering atoms to a surface, and they diffuse around when they reach the surface, but due to local strain, they'll accumulate in little patches, basically, and those become a nanocrystal or quantum dot. And you can tune the size of those via a number of parameters. But you're talking about something different, where you create, it seems like, a film, and then you intentionally break it up. Is that what you're saying?
That in essence, that's precisely correct. And let's rewind the clock to early 90s, when I think a lot of the quantum dot fundamental science was done. And I often use the real life analogy, where let's say you have a close to 300-pound linebackers crowding a room compared to average people like us. Then when they're confined in the same space, but simply because they're larger in size, they will start to experience compressive stress. So in a very similar way, atoms are the same way. Let's say you have what we call, let's say, gallium arsenide substrate, gallium atom and arsenic atom make up the substrate. And then let's say you start to add indium gallium arsenide on top of it. Then if you were to have one-to-one registry, atomic registry, because indium atoms are much bigger than gallium atoms, you start to build compressive stress. And nature's way of relieving that compressive stress is to have a three-dimensional growth, and you start to form these quantum dots. But our approach is very different. We actually grow indium gallium arsenide, and then we stress pattern the surface. What I mean by that is, let's say you have an array of nanopillars that elastically press down on indium gallium arsenide substrate. Then upon thermal activation, you can push these indium atoms out of the compressed region, in a way gearing them to diffuse into tensilely stressed areas, and therefore you can actually form quantum structures based on thermal diffusion of these larger atoms. And so that's a completely different way of. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So this thing that you're pushing into the surface, that's something you create, fabricate with dimensions such that it gives you resulting types of diffusion and quantum structures that you're looking for?
That's correct. And the beauty of that also is that it doesn't have to be nanoscopic. The actual press design could be microscopic. Typical stress field that you impart to the underlying substrate is quite large. And if you can imagine overlapping stress field, but leaving one small area, very nanoscopic area that's tensilely stressed, then these large atoms will preferentially migrate towards that nanoscopic region and therefore forming a nanoscopic quantum dots. However, the press itself doesn't have to be high resolution nanoscopic features.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So then another big area where you guys have been doing a lot of work has been in solar, in PV, and also in cooling, which is kind of almost a reverse-like process where you're sending energy from a surface out into space.
So then let's start with radiative cooling. And the idea has been around and practiced, I think, practically thousands of years. Just that as a science, you know how people observationally live with something that really works in nature or in our daily lives, but we never think about it scientifically until someone comes around and say, okay, this is how it works, and we can take that understanding to benefit our lives. So what I mean by that is that Persians and Egyptians were able to create ice even before the days of refrigeration, even before electricity was around, even before understanding what we chemical engineers typically think of as a heat pump, right? Even before that, they were able to create ice and enjoy it. And that process really largely relies on both evaporative cooling and radiative cooling. And so what that really means is that if you have a surface that is a very high emitter, especially in the mid-IR. So let me rewind. Okay, so sunlight spectrum spans, I don't know, anywhere from maybe a little over 300 nanometers to, let's say, about 900 nanometers. That's about the wavelength of the sunlight. Then what I call mid-IR, infrared, is about this particular range is about, I would say, longer than 900 nanometers, so from about micron all the way out to about 50 microns. That's what I would consider as mid-IR. And out of that mid-IR spectrum, there's a very relatively narrow window from 8 to 15 micron window where our atmosphere is completely transparent. So let's say you have a pair of eyes that can actually see mid-infrared, right? Then if you look into the sky, you will actually see the colors that are coming from water molecules, CO2, other gas molecules. You will actually see different colors. Meaning that if you were able to actually tell different colors in the mid-IR, that is, hypothetically. But interestingly enough, there is a finite window where atmosphere is very transparent, and that is from about 8 to 15 microns. And if you strongly emit in that area, what it means is that truly what you're seeing is a 0 Kelvin in outer space, and therefore you can effectively radiate your heat within that window and lose heat. So let's say if you can completely, your surface is so white that you can completely reject all the sunlight, either by reflection or by scattering. And if you're strongly emitting in that narrow window in the atmosphere, you can actually go below the ambient temperature even under the direct sunlight. And that's the key of radiative cooling.
Yeah, that's the cool thing, right? It makes sense that you can send heat via radiation to a surface or a region that's colder than the surface it's leaving. So your body is hot relative to deep space, so energy will be transported in that direction, except either you have something in the way, like the atmosphere sometimes, right? Or you have sunlight coming in and adding more energy to the system in the visible, and that kind of negates the whole process by a long shot if you're absorbing any of that visible light.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to have that super reflective visible too.
That's correct, Mike. I think you really hit it on the nail. That is, you want to reject all the sunlight while being able to radiate in the mid-IR. And that makes radiative cooling possible. And this actually, the resurgence of radiative cooling, I think the first person who captured the imagination was actually back in the 60s, a French scientist, Trombe, was the one who was able to measure literally, I believe, minus 35 degrees Celsius at night. So at night, you don't have the sunlight, but you can still strongly radiate. So he was able to achieve sub-freezing temperatures by radiative cooling. And then the resurgence of this area took place back in, I believe, 2014, when a Stanford group came out with a seminal paper in this area, recapturing people's imagination, and along with another group from Colorado. And so, that's the area that we've been pursuing actively of late.
And so it was more recent years from Sean Wei Fan's group, right?
That's
at
correct.
Stanford. Their first structure, which was published in Nature or something like this, had a pretty complex structure, right? The material that they used to be this radiative emitter in the IR and reflect the visible was fairly complex and some semi-exotic materials. And it seems to me that one of the things that happened in the intervening years has been the realization that you can do the same thing or something quite similar with far more common, simple materials. Is that a reasonable way to view it?
A round of applause to Mike. I think, yes, you capture that very, very accurately. And that is when the Stanford group came out with their system, it relied on essentially a Bragg reflector-based material system where you have to grow essentially what we call superlattice, essentially repeating layers and layer after layer of different exotic materials to completely reject the solar radiation, while also carefully choosing the material itself that emits heavily in the mid-IR. And that's how they were able to achieve radiative cooling. In our case, and among other groups as well, that we're trying to use very low-cost, commonly used materials in our lives to achieve the same, so that we can essentially make the material system much more manufacturable and low cost, so that we can reap the benefit of the science that we're doing.
And so listeners of the podcast know really well that I'm fascinated by this intersection of function and manufacturing scale. And
you're working on that as well, and I admire people who actually intersect that.
Well, it's if you ever want it to make it out of the lab, I mean, you kind of need both pieces. It's not that one or the other is more or less valuable, but once something's demonstrated, the next thing, or one of the next big things, is the manufacturability. And one of the things that I see a lot is people want to make the same thing manufacturable versus finding that marriage of manufacturability and functionality, coming off of what may be an absolute maximum in performance, but gaining orders of magnitude, let's say, in manufacturability at a hit of 10% in performance, right? That's to me, that's a really fascinating place to try and do science and engineering.
Yeah, I think very similar to the porous oxide spheres that you're working on. That's precisely it. I think they're both important. When I say both, fundamental science and engineering, they're both important. Once you learn the basic science, next thing that certainly we engineers do is how we can carefully choose the material system and the processes to, to exploit the science so that we make tangible products and processes that turn our lives much easier in some cases, and in some cases comfortable, save energy, etc. Many benefits to us.
I want to hear in a second about what you guys are doing in this case in the radiative cooling. I want you to describe your manufacturing process. But one more point I want to make is that often when people try to take that science and go forward with it, they understand perhaps that you need to take a hit in performance to make something manufacturable, but they often try along the same process trajectory that was done in the science lab to make it manufacturable, versus really deeply thinking about the basics of the manufacturing process and redoing it if necessary, making the structure maybe different as well. And I think the work you're going to describe is one of those things. We are not willing enough to deviate from the scientific demonstration on our way to manufacturability. So that's just a comment. But I want to hear. Please tell the listeners what materials and how you manufacture your radiative cooling materials.
Yeah, so I'll share with you our historical path. So when my colleague, by the way, I have a colleague in our department. He has the same first and last name as mine, but he has a different middle name. And Sang Eun Han. His background is in nanophotonics, comes out of a Minnesota group, and subsequently did his postdoc with Gang Chen at MIT. And he is the main intellectual driver, so I want to give full credit where it's due. But it's been a really fun journey working with him, providing my expertise in materials engineering, actual process development. So when you have complementary expertise, you can get to the destination much faster. So answering your question, we thought about what material would have very high emissivity in the mid-IR, and it turns out silicon dioxide, common glass, has that. And so we chose that. Glass, ubiquitous, everywhere, low cost, so we chose glass. And we thought about using something manufacturable. So in this case, a random media. When I say random, photonically random media, where we use spherical particles, silicon dioxide glass particles that are properly sized, but they're randomly packed.
What does proper size mean?
So that's something that I can't share with you. That's the secret sauce.
I'd have to kill you.
Yeah. Secret sauce. And that is, let's say, however, what I can tell you is that given the refractive index of the silicon dioxide and given the refractive index of the surrounding material, it could be air or another material. Given the refractive indices, we can actually model the system to come up with what size particles would work. So let's say, actually, we've been sitting on this manuscript for some time. Patent application went out first, that we're using hollow spheres embedded in high index, well, when I say high index, higher than vacuum or air, high index polymer surrounding matrix. So it could be a paint binder, or it could be silicone material that you can easily purchase even from Lowe's or any sort of hardware store you can find in your neighborhood. And so in that case, hollow spheres contain air, and then it's surrounded by either silicone or paint binder that have refractive index closer to 1.4, 1.5, 1.7, etc. But if you, given the two refractive indices, that is air versus, let's say, silicone, we're able to find what size spheres would work best so that once these spheres are randomized in the silicone matrix, it will maximize the essentially reflectivity of sunlight while maximizing the emissivity in the mid-IR.
So you're asking these spheres to do double duty, or in the sense that you want them to reflect and emit, versus an approach which is maybe two layers, where you have a layer that's responsible for visible light reflection and a separate layer that's responsible for radiative emission?
So it's actually multiple, but two key factors are, you're right in that. The answer is you're right.
It's not what I'm looking for, but
yeah.
But thank you.
So let's say, look at glass. As a bulk material, it's very transparent, right?
Yeah.
But if you turn them into somewhere around micron level, so when I say micron level, it could be anywhere from half a micron to tens of microns, right? Broad range. I can't tell you the number, but
okay.
If you have the right size spheres, then all of a sudden the material you thought to be transparent becomes highly scattering, and no sunlight will pass through that medium. So what was transparent in the visible as a bulk material becomes completely reflective or highly scattering medium, so that you achieve complete solar rejection.
I see. And real quick, can you tell people why you won't tell us what sizes work?
Because it is different from what commercial solar rejection paint uses. It's different than dioxide-based paint or solar rejection products that are out on the market. It's a different size. We know how to size these things correctly given the materials that you want to choose, and that's why I can't share that with you. And that's
you
the
have
key
a company, right?
That is correct. We have a small company that's based on this technology.
So what's the company called?
Ozazda Energy, and Ozazda means solar or sun in one of the Native American dialects here in New Mexico.
And when was it founded?
2017.
Okay, so you're in stealth mode, maybe.
Yeah, early 2017. We got some traction from paint companies and big chemical manufacturing companies. So it's an ongoing process.
Sure. Maybe if we have time at the end, we can come back and hear a little bit. I mean, you won't tell us about the science, but the other aspects of founding a company.
Yeah, of course. Now, fully answering your question, then, as I said, as a bulk material, also silicon dioxide has very high emissivity in the mid-IR, and that's why PV panels, front and now today bifacial modules, for both front and back, have high emissivity silicon dioxide glass. So it's a good thing if you want to keep the panels cooler than otherwise. So silicon dioxide is a good material to have if you want to radiatively cool something. But here's a kicker. If you properly size the particles right, then you can increase the emissivity by 10 to 20%, it turns out. And that's the edge, additional edge. So
this is interesting, right? This radiative cooling, you could go from this material out to anything cooler, but the most bang for your buck, I guess, is outside, where space is, accessible. Except then, if you're outside, you're also dealing with the sun. So that's the thing. It's a double-edged sword. But I guess I was thinking about. Sorry to interrupt again. I was thinking about where else I can imagine these in a solar cell to keep the cell cool. You can imagine them on roofs just to keep buildings cooler than they would have otherwise been in a passive way. But are there other uses of these radiative coolers inside?
Oh, indoor applications I really haven't thought about. Thank you for posing that, but I haven't really deeply thought about indoor applications. Okay. I suppose you could turn that into a tanning salon, because if you turn up a light, it will be bright white.
I mean, I guess another thing is if you have an object, let's say it's an engine, so it's not the surface of a building, which is, around room temperature, outdoor temperature, and you need space relative to that to be much cooler. If something's already hot, like a side of a chemical reactor or something, and you wanted to radiatively cool it, I guess it would be a different combination of sphere sizes and such, because the temperatures would be different. But you could envision doing that not to space, but to some other surface that's actually at room temperature. Yeah,
so, I mean, as long as there is a delta T, then yes. And then if one temperature happens to be super hot, when I say hot, thousands of degrees, whether it's Celsius or Fahrenheit, then radiative cooling would make sense in that case. Whether it's engine cooling, let's say, or reactor that's facing the outside or facing a cooler surface, or even you can imagine transportation where, let's say, 18-wheelers, these big containers covered with our coating technology, especially if the merchandise they're carrying happen to be temperature sensitive and you have to keep them cool, then yes, it would make sense to have such a coating on containers, vehicles, etc. Also, let's say in remote areas where you have to carry or transport your medicine and the medicine has to be kept cooled, then again, using this coating technology would make sense.
Right, and I don't think we said this explicitly in the last several minutes, but right, to be clear, if you're talking about coating buildings, solar cells, things of enormous area, your manufacturing technology better be pretty inexpensive, right? And so that's where Ozazda is specializing.
Yeah, that is true. Especially in the PV market, price really determines even if you have a brilliant, out-of-this-world technology, if it's not manufacturable at a very extremely low cost, because market is so competitive with very small profit margin, that technology won't make it. Yeah.
So that's a great segue, I think, into the articles you had sent.
Yeah.
Sang had sent me a couple articles about the solar industry. So this is more about solar PV, but highly related to what Sang is directly working on and what Ozazda is working on. And we'll put these links in the show notes. One was, or maybe two were from the New York Times. No, one was from the New York Times, one was from the LA Times, and one was from PV Magazine. The long story made short is that a lot of jobs have been lost in solar cell manufacturing in the United States due to production of solar cells, low-cost solar cells in China.
Correct. Certainly, I don't fully understand the business model of China, but at the end of the day, the products coming out of China were very low cost compared to what we produced. And so essentially ran a lot of U.S. manufacturing companies out of business. And along with that, we lost a lot of jobs. Correct.
And to be clear, right, it's maybe lower costs in absolute manufacturing, but then other kinds of subsidies that were coming from the Chinese government that made it even more inexpensive. And in many cases, Chinese manufacturers were dumping solar cells on the market, which means putting them on the market for less than it costs to manufacture them.
Exactly. So from the company point of view, if you're getting a subsidy, bottom line making profit from government subsidy while you're dumping the product in the U.S. market, then of course you'll blow everyone out of the water here in the U.S. While the companies are continuing to make the profit. Yeah.
And this has more or less been the story of the solar industry for the last decade, right?
That is correct. And the sort of the punctuation today is the two articles that I sent you came out in November and December, and Altas, which is a company that was based on the technology developed at Caltech and UC Berkeley. Now they just went through a layoff that large number of employees essentially were let go. and it's bought out by a foreign company. That's the latest news, and it was bought up by a foreign company, and subsequently there was recent layoff. Really was not a good news for obviously for the employees, and the LA Times PV Magazine news. I think I forget now which one it was that. SunPower, which has been one of the biggest manufacturing companies, PV manufacturing companies, modules that is, here in the U.S., announced to move their manufacturing line overseas. So again, this is a case where manufacturing is moving out of the U.S.
This is effectively, it's pretty similar to kind of the global foundries thing, right?
Correct.
Right, that same kind of thing happened where manufacturing was overseas and design stayed in the U.S.
Yeah.
Right, and in SunPower, man, they have quite a history in the solar industry. I mean, they were there from a very early beginning, right? And Dick Swanson, who was the CEO for a long time, is famous in solar circles. They had extremely efficient solar cells when the average solar cell was not efficient. Right, that's changed a bit in recent years, but it's a real change of the state of affairs in the last decade.
Yeah, so observationally, yes, it is sad to see that it's the technology that we developed. In this case, more specifically. And certainly there are many groups who worked on it, I'm sure, but Dick Swanson, your alma mater, Stanford, out of Stanford.
That's why I know, or know of him. I don't know him.
Yeah. So, technology was there, developed here in the U.S., and yet at the end of the day, manufacturing is done overseas. And it doesn't, it's sad. It's a sad affair.
Yeah, and certainly if you look narrowly within solar, right? And so that's, at some level, I agree, and at some level you have to be careful to focus on one industry, which may be, better in one area and worse in another. And we could come up with similar examples where something's really good in the United States and less good somewhere else, and any other country for that matter. So on average, things look different than when you focus on specific industries where it looks much more heterogeneous. But it's an interesting question, right? So you're developing this low-cost coating, and how do you think about this kind of competition from abroad? You could be wildly successful in the next couple of years. It's working really well. You've contracted with Dow Chemical, who's manufacturing it. How do you stay ahead of the game, or how do you outcompete the players like China?
That's certainly a high dollar question, Mike, and I think. For any company for that matter in technology, you will have to continuously innovate, and to remain technologically competitive. I mean, it's a fiercely competitive world. Independent of whether it's China or Europe or other Asian countries, European countries, South American countries, and whatnot, the market is very competitive, and to remain ahead of other competitors, you have to constantly innovate and come up with new and better products. And I think that pressure is even greater today than maybe 30 years ago when the U.S. was leading the manufacturing in the world. And so the pressure's there. I don't know if you were to ask me what is the clear solution to this or strategy. I don't have one yet. I'm thinking, but I don't have one. I can't give you a clear answer, or this would be the strategy for Ozazda in the next 5-6 years or 10 years to make sure that we remain at the forefront of this technology.
This is such a tough thing, and it comes also back a bit to geopolitics. I think part of the solar thing of the last decade was slow realization by the West that other countries were not willing to buy into the system of economics that they were playing in. And that's their choice. And I think took a little while for folks to wake up to that reality. And maybe, there's lots of transition, I think, globally right now. But it seems like we may see different groupings of players coalesce around each other that are, in a cohort, so to speak, who all agree, we're going to play by the rules so that, this is something we agree to, and the rules of the game are set. But your point about needing to innovate is absolutely crucial, and I worry that as a nation, and this is a theme of many episodes of the podcast, that we're not spending enough time on this manufacturability question. And even when we think we are, we're not diving deep enough and really asking the tough questions about how do you take some scientific discovery and translate it into a manufacturable product.
So I think, Mike, one positive hope that I have is that I think I really truly laud federal government for starting an initiative in advanced manufacturing. Especially DOE has a division within Department of Energy, Office of Advanced Manufacturing, and that's just one example. But I think that's where we can regain, U.S. can regain its prominence again, where it relies on high technology, or rather a lot of the fundamental science and great technologies that are coming out of our university labs and corporate labs, and really excelling in manufacturing this cutting edge science products or technological products, and so that we remain competitive in manufacturing, but in a way, different kinds of manufacturing. This is not a manufacturing of steel materials and whatnot, but rather advanced manufacturing of, let's say, the radiative cooling coating technology that will keep your cooling costs down by 20-30% in the summer, etc. Something that has not been done and relies on high tech, and providing a manufacturing solution for these great technologies that we develop here in the U.S., we may be able to regain, former glory of in manufacturing.
Yeah, no, and I think
I hope I wasn't too sappy about this.
No. I mean, so it's always a question of do you want to, just because that's the way it was in the past? Does that make sense for the future? And I think the one thing people miss when or had missed when a lot of the policies were put in place that pushed a lot of manufacturing offshore was the kind of synergistic effect of having manufacturing local and having people who have certain skill sets that can, they may not apply it to traditional manufacturing, but they can apply it to a new kind of manufacturing, or cross and jump across disciplines and create new products. When you don't have any of those skill sets anymore, then you can't do any of that stuff. You don't have the glue, basically. You don't have any of the grease to make the new thing go.
Yeah, and I'll share with you my own take, is that when the manufacturing jobs are lost, I think that's when we start to lose our middle class. And when the middle class is strong, everyone gets to afford the lifestyle that we always thought possible in, certainly following World War II in the 50s all the way through the 70s and 80s, the kind of lifestyle that you and I grew up watching, that is doable when the middle class is strong for everyone. And I think that's why I believe that creating manufacturing jobs is important. It's not the only way, but it's one of the ways to create the middle class and make it stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 100% on board with the fact that we need a broad-based middle class, just that generally broadly people are doing well. That is critical to a society, to a functioning democracy, all of the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Whether manufacturing, and it seems like that could be a part of it, but because that's how we had it several decades ago, it doesn't, to me, necessarily mean that you have to have that to have the middle class. It could certainly be a huge portion of it, and we don't have it today, so that's a hole that we could fill, and it would probably help in the way you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, what would fill that vacuum is unclear.
Right.
You're right. Just because what enabled us to have that middle class from manufacturing may not be the solution today. So, yeah, that's something to be debated.
Agreed, but I think we're on the same page about wanting a broad, functioning middle class. So let's talk about your company real briefly. What motivated you to start it? Is it greed? Is it just excitement about the technology and helping to solve the energy problem? What was it?
You're starting to sound like Gordon Gekko.
Oh, sorry. That's really, oh man.
Greed is good, right? It's virtue. No. The answer to that is I really wanted to see what we were working on in our lab, and I wanted to turn that into a usable product that would benefit everyone, preferably. And in order to do that, I felt that I have to take it to the market, and to do so, I have to create a company. Do I know anything about running a company in the beginning? Absolutely not. And so it's been a completely new learning curve. I knew nothing about running a business, raising money, interacting with entrepreneurs who essentially provide the private capital for the company, working with marketing people, how important marketing is, branding, how important branding is for the company, anywhere from creating a logo to having a stationery that would really make your company look visible, internet, website design. I mean, these are just, there's so many things that I had to learn along the way.
So real quick, can you be honest and tell us whether your stationery has radiative cooling coatings on it?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Of course,
Hands
good,
down.
okay.
No, it's just a white piece of paper. Yeah.
Which is not bad. It can't cool, but it's okay. It's not absorbing that much light, but it's not cooling either. So,
no.
So where I guess you mentioned this a minute ago. Your funding is largely through companies, or have you made yourself? Have you availed yourself of SBIR, STTR type of grants?
So initially, the technology that we didn't mention today that Ozazda Energy is working on has to do with functionalized carbon nanotubes that go into silver paste, and this is the kinds of paste that's used to screen print grid fingers, bus bars on solar cells, and we're essentially by putting in the reinforcement, carbon nanotube reinforcement, we're making the grid fingers stronger and much more crack tolerant. And so that funding, the funding to support that work initially came from the Air Force, then turned that into SBIR, and subsequently we were able to translate the technology that was initially meant for space PV to terrestrial silicon PV, and we had to pivot very hard, but we were able to do so from the generous support with the generous support from Department of Energy Duramet program, and so far we've been getting very strong support from the Department of Energy to take this product to market.
When will we see it on our shelves?
I really like to push ahead. We are currently raising private capital. I think there will be another much bigger round in coming April. And so we would like to use that as a launch point, and maybe within 18 months, I'd like to have a product on the shelf.
Wow. Well, I look forward to having you back on when that product does hit the shelves. In our remaining time, I'd like to jump to the lightning round. Okay, you ready?
Sure.
Okay, so let's start off with what's the most important thing your students don't know about Sang M. Han?
My students don't know.
About you.
Oh, okay. So to keep my sanity, every Thursday I have three guitars, Gibson Les Paul and a Martin, Dreadnought Martin, and another nylon Cordoba. So to keep my sanity, I actually play music every Thursday. I just turned 50 this year, and if you were to say, yeah, I'm having a jam session, that sounds somewhat juvenile and throw me back to the teenage years when you want to become a rock star. But yeah, I do that. I play electric blues mostly. I am stuck in the minor key all the time. I don't know. I didn't grow up oppressed.
If you keep reading those New York Times articles that you sent me, though, you will be.
Yeah, you have a point. But yeah. But I play, I jam it out with my instructor, Sabino, who went to a conservatory in Argentina. He lives here in the U.S. today, and great instructor, anywhere from classical guitar music to jazz, blues, rock and roll. We can just pick up a score and we jam it out for an hour or so, and that keeps my sanity. And I don't think many students know that about me.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Who were some of your early mentors?
So dating back to my college years, I did my undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley. I truly feel that I really grew up there as became an adult. And after my first year, I did my summer internship or summer undergraduate research with David Graves, who's a pretty well-known scientist in plasma processing. Subsequently, I worked with a few others who did MEMS work, and also I worked with plasma, MEMS, also polymer science. I don't know if you know John Prausnitz.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so at the time he was doing using polymer matrix to do protein separations, or even using that as a drug delivery system. So he was measuring a lot of the partition coefficients for proteins and drugs in different polymer matrix that could be potentially used as a drug delivery system. So I did a lot of measurements in that area. In fact, one of my co-authored publications is in that area, as well as co-author in a book chapter many moons ago. This is when I was an undergrad. So these are all great mentors. I wish I can remember all the names. Then I went to work with Lam Research located in Fremont after getting my BS degree. And I realized that after about 9 months, I didn't want to become a glorified wafer pusher. And so I went back to get my PhD. E-Ray Idle, of course, is my PhD advisor and a mentor, lifetime mentor. Great influence, scientific influence, as well as always growing up as a person.
E-Ray was on episode 23 of the show, so we'll put that in the show notes.
Okay, thank you. And Roya Mabudian, who's my postdoctoral advisor at UC Berkeley. In fact, I gave up my NRC fellowship to work for her at the time, and I truly felt that I would do better science going back to my undergraduate alma mater than going out to the host institution that would allow me to have the NRC fellowship. And so, these are some of the. I wish I can name all of them. If you can bear with me, I can look them up.
No, but, we're good. Everyone is going to turn off the podcast in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so we all need good mentors. What are some of your favorite books, blogs, and podcasts? And we know Nanovation is one of your favorites, but you can exclude that one for now.
I try to read things that are outside science. There is a bookstore, locally owned bookstore called Page One here in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico. It used to be really well doing. I mean, they had two bookstores here in town, but because of the advent of internet and online sales, it's gone down to just a single store here in town. But I really enjoy on Saturday especially with my sons. I will go have breakfast at a restaurant right next door, and then we walk on over to that bookstore to pick out a book or two. And the latest one that I read is actually a Little Paris bookstore, where it tells a man's journey in southern France. Certainly in love with books, and he owns a barge where it's a barge. It's a living quarter and a little bookstore, and tells about his journey in life and the love affair and whatnot. It was just a fun story, and the reason why I say that is because I was in southern France this summer. I was in Marseille. I was able to drive around the southern part of France, and it was just I don't know. You read the story, and then you have this particular image or images in your head, and then being able to capture that again by actually visiting and essentially eating my way through southern France. That was a fantastic journey. So,
what are some things, or what is one thing you're excited about right now in any area of life, science or not science?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, maybe it's a little too personal, but I met a great woman in 2 years ago. And it's been going very well. And so that's probably the biggest news in my life, that science is important. Running a business is important. Teaching brings me tremendous joy, especially when you see both undergraduate and graduate students just beginning to get their own intellectual independence. All of that is joyful moments. But I think something personal good happened, and I'm really I feel grateful. I feel blessed. And my kids are growing up really well. So
congratulations.
Yeah.
Tell us about a time you failed and what you learned from the experience.
Maybe I can share this with faculty members who just received their tenure, independent of which institution, where you are, that once you pass that process, I think there is typically, what awaits you, unfortunately, is a valley of death. And that is, you don't necessarily have the edge of taking advantage of these programs, funding programs that are targeted towards assistant professors, tenure track assistant professors, but you don't quite have the name out there to be able to land big funding opportunities. And so that's the tough period. And I think I wish I had a mentor who could have warned me about that. And I certainly do that with my mentees, that this is real. And I try to help my colleagues who are going through that stage, try to help them as much as I can to survive through that period and being able to practice their science.
Do you have any little nuggets of advice for people going through that?
Wow, it's a tough journey. If I were to say persevere, that would be belying every person's journey is different, but that would be belying the difficulty and individualized path that everyone has to walk through. It's not an easy path. I can't say persevere. Simply seek out help from your senior colleagues who are receptive to that, and I think voicing that, I think talking about that is also, it's a good thing amongst your peers and also with the senior colleagues who can serve as your mentor.
Okay. So a college student comes up to you saying that they're interested in a career in science or engineering.
Yeah.
What advice do you give them?
Become a rock star.
Easier said than done. Okay.
Yeah.
And last but not least, what do you know about science or engineering that you wish you knew 20 years ago?
Oh, I have tremendous respect for colleagues who are in physics. I wish I had scientifically. I wish I had a little more physics background. That that would so for example, when I have a scientific discussion with my colleague Sang Han on nanophotonics and how light interacts with different material systems, that's where my lack of physical understanding comes through. And I mean, it's impossible to understand everything in life, and I'm certainly humbled by that. And but I wish I had a little more physics.
And there's physicists out there saying they wish they had a little more engineering. So on that note, let me thank Sang M. Han from the University of New Mexico for coming on the show. It's been delightful.
Oh, thanks, Mike.
You've been listening to Nanovation. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a rating or write a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are available at philolab.com/nanovation. Nanovation is recorded in the Marcus Nanotechnology Building on the campus of Georgia Tech. Andrew Cannon edits the show. I'm Mike Filler. See you next time.